Join our teams across the nations and regions for the news where you are. Goodbye.
Hello, good evening. I'm Roger Johnson. Welcome to a special edition of North West Tonight, this evening live in Manchester, as the city's emergency services are severely criticised for their response to the 2017 arena terror attack. A catastrophic failure of command is the devastating verdict of the Public Inquiry's report into their actions on the night. Sir John's.
We heard heartbreaking evidence of the injured, hearing the sirens of ambulances, knowing paramedics were close by, only for them not to arrive.
Sir John Saunders, the chair of the inquiry, said that communication between the police, the fire and the ambulance on the night was virtually non-existent. Greater Manchester Police has apologised. The report says that the two most senior commanders made no effective contribution to the emergency response.
Our actions were substantially inadequate and fell short of what the public have every right to expect.
The report finds that one victim, John Atkinson from Bury, could have survived if the emergency response had been better.
It is now clear beyond any doubt that on the night of the bombing, John was totally failed at every stage.
It's now more than 5 years since Manchester's darkest night, when a terrorist attacked the audience as they left a concert at the Manchester Arena, injuring hundreds and murdering 22 people. Today, the second volume of the Public Inquiry report, a public inquiry which began in September 2020, which finished in March of this year, 1,000 pages looking at the way in which the emergency services responded on the night. Sir John Saunders, who's written this report, who's presided over the public inquiry, when he stood to give his summary of his findings at 2:30 this afternoon, was quiet, he was calm, but he was devastating. He said that the police, the fire service and the ambulance on that night all failed. Everyone involved, Sir John said, thought that they were doing their best, but in many cases, he said, that best was just not good enough. Some members of the emergency services, he was keen to point out, acted heroically. Members of the public, he said, who helped were the very best of society. They demonstrated the best of society, but the emergency services were let down by their commanders, by their leaders and by their systems. And as a result, those who were left injured and dying on the floor were let down as well. That had fatal consequences for one man, John Atkinson. Sir John and his report has found that he would have survived if he'd received better, more timely medical assistance. Over the course of this special programme, we're going to look at the report's findings. We're going to hear from the emergency services and from the families who lost loved ones on the night. But first, here's our social affairs correspondent, Abby Jones, looking back on this afternoon's events.
As the shocked and wounded emerged from the arena in the aftermath of the bombing, many more lay critically injured inside, desperate for help from the emergency services. But today's report says they were chaotic and unprepared, their training inadequate, communication between them non-existent. If there had not been such catastrophic failings, one of the 22 murdered, John Atkinson, would probably have survived. But the inquiry found it was highly unlikely the youngest victim, 8-year-old Safi Rose Roussos, could have been saved.
There were significant failings by a number of organisations in preparation and training for an emergency such as this, and in their actions on the night of the attack. We heard heartbreaking evidence of the injured and the rescuers who were in the city room, hearing the sirens of ambulances, knowing paramedics were close by, expecting their imminent arrival, only for them not to arrive in the sort of numbers which were needed.
For the families of those killed who've waited 5 years for answers, there was pain and anger.
It is now clear beyond any doubt that on the night of the bombing, John was totally failed at every stage, both by the private medical providers at the arena, ET UK, and the emergency services. It is crystal clear that due to those failings, John died from injuries that he could and should have survived.
My two daughters that lost their mum when they were teenagers, You can't begin to imagine what it must be like for I turn up occasionally at these meetings, and every time I do arrive, I go away disappointed. So there's nothing new happened today that will make me feel better.
So what, according to today's report, went so badly wrong? Sir John highlighted very significant failures with Greater Manchester Police. 2 of the most senior commanders on the night made no effective contribution. The force duty officer failed to declare a safe cold zone early enough for fire crews and paramedics to go in. Sir John said that should have saved John Atkinson's life. There were very substantial problems with the command response from the ambulance service. It sent in too few paramedics. Its approach was unduly cautious, which was a terrible disappointment to the injured and rescuers. And there was condemnation of inadequate medical services provided at the arena by private company ET UK. Fire service commanders, believing the area around the arena was too unsafe, sent fire crews away, not towards the incident, past ambulances travelling in the opposite direction. It was 2 hours before they arrived on the scene. And North West Fire Control, which handles fire and rescue 999 calls, had no major incident plan. Tonight, the emergency services, one by one, repeated their apologies for the failings of that night.
Our coordination of the response to this atrocity was poor.
On behalf of everyone in British Transport Police, I am truly sorry.
We let the families and the public down in their time of need.
We failed to establish adequate communication between our control rooms and each other.
As well as searing failings, this report also includes 149 recommendations. Survivors and bereaved families still waiting for legislation to be passed after the first inquiry report want them acted on quickly, so real change comes out of such pain and loss. Since the bombing, hundreds of firefighters have been given training with the police and ambulance services in how to respond to a similar terror attack. But that can't change the mistakes of the past or bring back those whose lives were cut brutally short, one of whom we now know could have been saved. Abby Jones, BBC North West Tonight.
You heard from Stephen Howe in Abby's report. His wife Alison was one of those who died. He doesn't want to just see this gathering dust on a shelf. He wants to see action. He doesn't want to be disappointed again. And Fegan Murray, whose son Martin Hett was one of those who died, has campaigned for a law to improve security at venues right across the country in his memory and in memory of the 22 who lost their lives. She said today she just wants action.
What I ask is the government finally brings forward the legislation required to ensure the country's safety, despite the apparent government support that I have been promised and I keep being promised. This much-needed law appears to be constantly delayed. Had Martin's Law been in place that night, we now know that precious life would have been saved. We can't turn the clock back, but for every passing day that today's recommendations and Martin's Law are not in place is yet another day where all of our safety is at risk. Today is not a day for finger pointing, but a day for learning and moving forward with measures to keep us safe.
And Sir John Saunders again in this report, as he did in Volume 1, saying that law, Martin's Law, the Protect duty, needs to be introduced. Now we're going to hear from the emergency services in a moment, but first let's have a look at exactly what went wrong on the night, what they did and what they didn't do. Matt Trewern from BBC Radio Manchester has been in court for every day of the 196 days of evidence over the last 18 months, and he's been taking a look at the timeline on that fateful night.
The bomb exploded in the arena foyer at exactly 10:31. Within seconds, first responders raced to help those dying and injured. Among them are police officers, arena first aiders and members of the public.
Hello, this is the ambulance service. Is the patient breathing?
So I'm at the MEN Arena in Manchester. The bomb just got off in the foyer.
Okay, just hold the line.
Police emergency, hello?
Yeah, there's been an explosion at Manchester Arena!
The on-call fire service commander is told about the explosion and warned there are reports of a gunman, reports that turn out to be false. But worried about their safety, he tells crews to mobilise at a fire station 3 miles from the arena, a decision that baffles and frustrates firefighters.
And then there's the feeling of guilt. Well, maybe if I did something ever so small, you know, you can hold your head up high, but to stand there and then do nothing all that time, it was embarrassing, shameful.
11 minutes after the explosion, Paddy Ennis is the first of only 3 paramedics to enter the scene that evening. It will be another half an hour before any other fully trained medic goes into the foyer, where casualties are desperate for help.
I were praying for more people to come and help people because the times was clocking on here. And in that moment in time, I really was concerned that people were dying.
At 10:43, armed police arrive in the foyer. They establish there's no immediate threat and call for ambulances to get to the scene. At just before 11 o'clock, almost half an hour after the bomb went off, those in the foyer helping the injured decide they just can't wait any longer for medical help to get to them. But there are no stretchers, so they decide to carry the casualties out down these stairs on advertising boards and metal barriers. Paramedics are starting to arrive here at the bottom to treat them. But command failures continue, and firefighters eventually arrive at the arena more than 2 hours after the first 999 calls.
I felt ashamed to be a firefighter. I felt like we'd let the people of Greater Manchester down, that we're there to help and we didn't do our job.
Many casualties, even those critically injured, have an agonising wait to be taken to hospital. More than 4 hours after the bombing, the final patient is put into an ambulance, marking the end of the immediate emergency response to Manchester's darkest night.
Phil McCann's been at a press conference in the last hour or so listening to the emergency services response to the report. What did they say, Phil?
Well, Roger, the emergency services whose failings we've just seen laid bare in that report by Matt there, they all walked into this room just a few hours ago. They sat down and, well, they all apologised. They apologised to people, well, like the family of John Atkinson, who, as today's report makes clear, may have survived if it wasn't for the late arrival of first responders.
We wish we could have done more to have saved John and got to John quicker than we did. As we've already heard, there were a number of multi-agency failings that contributed to not perhaps getting to John as quickly as anyone would have liked.
Also apologising today, Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service. They took more than 2 hours to arrive. At one point they drove in the wrong direction. The Chief Fire Officer of Greater Manchester said today that their response at the time was wholly inadequate and ineffective. Also speaking today, the Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police, Stephen Watson, who was not in post at the time of the attack. He said their response had been poor. He said what happened had been planned for, but he said that planning did not take root.
Our actions were substantially inadequate and fell short of what the public have every right to expect. And for this, I apologise unreservedly.
Now, Stephen Watson there took over from Greater Manchester's former Chief Constable Ian Hopkins, who stayed in post until 3 years after the attack. Today's report had some big criticism for him, and the Greater Manchester Metro Mayor Andy Burnham also spoke here, and he said that he had been misled by Ian Hopkins over what happened on the night. And Andy Burnham has responsibility for holding Greater Manchester Police to account.
It is my view that the force tried to stick for too long to a corporate narrative that suggested it had acted effectively. That wasn't just disrespectful to the families and those injured. It had the effect of misleading myself and the Deputy Mayor.
There's been criticism too of the government from a solicitor representing some of the families who said that they still hadn't learnt lessons from the 7/7 London terror attacks that happened 12 years before the attack on Manchester Arena. The Home Secretary today said that she will carefully consider the recommendations from today's report.
Phil, thank you. The experiences of the 22 who died and many of the survivors have been central to the public inquiry. As we've heard, John Atkinson could have been saved if he'd had quicker and better medical attention. Safi Rose Roussos, the other one who was central to this, two of the The victims who may have been saved, well, Safi Rose, they said, may have, but it was highly unlikely that she would have survived her injuries. No one was prepared for the unprecedented devastation when Salman Abedi detonated his device. The scale of the dead and wounded who desperately needed help. But one of the things the inquiry wrestled with is only 3 paramedics were ever sent inside the arena, and then mainly to triage. For care worker John Atkinson and 8-year-old Safi Rose Roussos, that meant precious time and vital treatment ebbed away.
I'm with a man that is really injured. His leg's pumping.
You need to put pressure on it, okay? So have you got anything on you? Have you got something like a tie or a belt? You need to tie it around the top of his leg, all right?
Take your belt off.
That badly injured man was John Atkinson. Bleeding heavily from his legs, he crawled over to Ronald Blake, who made that 999 call. Ron had no first aid training, but tied his wife's belt around John's leg and stayed holding it for nearly an hour.
All I could see was bleeding, but he was talking, told me his name and all that, asked him where he was from, so he communicated.
But 47 minutes later, John was still lying on the floor in agony with no medical attention.
It just seemed to last forever. It seemed to go on and on and on, and nobody would come in, so I just kept trying to talk to John. Somebody come over and said something and walked off.
Officers and members of the public decided to use a metal barrier to carry John down the stairs. It took 7 minutes and nearly gave way. It was 53 minutes before the care worker was treated by paramedics on the cold floor of Victoria Station, and another 35 before he was taken to hospital. Experts told the inquiry if he'd had quicker treatment, including medical tourniquets, he would have had a high chance of survival.
Even when emergency services did arrive, they just didn't treat John in a timely way. They didn't, properly notice the level of the severity of his injuries and the fact that he was still, the bleeding hadn't stopped enough, the fact that he was deteriorating.
An hour and 16 minutes after the arena explosion, John Atkinson suffered a cardiac arrest as he was placed on an ambulance stretcher. He died shortly after arriving at hospital.
Hello, this is Safi, and welcome to my car.
Safi Rose Roussos had gone to the concert with her mum, Lisa. Her joy at watching Ariana Grande captured in this final video. She was just 5 metres from the blast. She rapidly lost blood from serious leg injuries which were never treated. No paramedics came into the foyer to help her. It was left to an off-duty nurse, police officers and an arena t-shirt vendor to care for her. Safi's family had understood that their daughter died instantly, but the inquiry heard she lived for over an hour and was conscious and able to talk. 26 minutes after the explosion, with no medical help arriving, Safi was lifted onto an advertising board and carried out to the street. An officer flagged down an ambulance. Safi asked the paramedic if she was going to die. The off-duty nurse who was with her told the inquiry of her anguish.
I knew I was losing her. Her efforts, she was struggling to make efforts at that point. When I was first with her, she was working hard and she was fighting. And I think she was fighting as hard as she could, but we needed to help her.
At 20 to midnight, more than an hour after the attack, Safi died in hospital. 2 sets of medical experts gave evidence at the inquiry. One group said that Safi's injuries were too severe to survive. The other said it was possible she could have lived if she'd received basic medical treatment.
What Safi went through, I will never forgive. That poor little girl hung in there for someone to come and help her. What she received was a bloody advertisement board and untrained people doing the best they could.
The families of Safi Rose Roussos and John Atkinson have learned harrowing details of how their loved ones waited helplessly for medical treatment which never arrived, asking, could they have been saved? Tonight, they finally have the heartbreaking answer. Well, Safi was from Leyland in Lancashire. Her parents, Andrew and Lisa, left Lancashire after what happened at the arena and never went back. They moved to Dorset, where today they watched the findings with Annabelle Tiffin.
As they watch Sir John Saunders, Andrew and Lisa Roussos face an unbearable truth. Their daughter, the youngest victim, was let down by the emergency services. Just an hour before this public statement, they'd found out there was a remote possibility that their little girl, Safi Rose, could have been saved with better treatment.
And Safi fought that night, but unfortunately, she was let down. Badly let down.
I believe in my heart that she would have survived had she been given the correct medical attention she needed. I do believe that.
During the inquiry, experts had disagreed on whether she might have survived. For Lisa, hearing there was even a remote chance is vindication of what they've always believed.
So when you see it written in black and white, how does that make you feel?
I've never understood how the first lot of experts could say she was unsurvivable when even basic first aid wasn't applied. If everything was applied that should have been, i.e. tourniquets, leg splinting, basic stuff, really. These wasn't even applied. If everything had been done and tried to save her life and then come back and say that, then I can accept that. But I can't accept that.
Andrew says on the night everything went wrong, and this report confirms it.
Again, we've sat through the last 2 years of evidence, and it's so hard to listen to all the excuses, the justification, that basically the coordination of the emergency services that night
and the lack of communication
was so wrong. Everything went wrong.
Do you have any kind of feeling today that you have reached some sort of conclusion?
But Safi fought for her life, and people said that what they did was correct and adequate, and it wasn't. So today gives us that it's okay, Safi. You did your best, but it just didn't arrive. And that's what it gives us.
It was the emergency services that let her down.
Annabelle Tiffin, BBC North West Tonight.
Let's talk to Matt Trewern, as I said, from BBC Radio Manchester, who's followed this inquiry from start to finish. What are your reflections tonight?
Well, as devastating as this report will be for the families of those who died and survivors, it won't come as a huge surprise. I mean, they've followed this catalogue of failure day in, day out in the evidence of the witnesses, but it's now there in black and white. The emergency response was just not good enough. It let so many people down, particularly John Atkinson's family. But it doesn't end here. The third and final report will look at what counter-terrorism police and MI5 knew about the bomber Salman Obeidi, because he was on their radar. And, you know, we've already seen two highly critical reports from this public inquiry. I think there's a very good chance we may well soon see a third report of that nature.
And that'll be in the new year?
Yes, we believe so, yeah.
Matt, thank you very much indeed. Matt Trewern there. Over the years we've heard from many of the emergency service personnel who were involved on the night. There's anger and frustration from them that in some way they have been blamed. Well, Sir John Saunders was very clear. Individually, many of them acted heroically on the night, but they were let down by their leadership and they were let down by their systems. But at the end of it all, What happened on the 22nd of May 2017 was all about one man, one murderous terrorist who killed 22 people and left hundreds more injured. And that is the bottom line from all of us. Good night.
Please don't let my daughter be a victim.
He was just unique, wasn't he? He was just very, very characterful and he just loved life.
What the families have gone through, and it just being such young children.
This has been the most horrific incident we have ever faced here in Greater Manchester, and one that we all hoped we would never see.
It's heartbreaking. It's just children.
We're thinking about them, and they won't be forgotten.
But we won't take defeat, and we don't want your pity, because this is the place where we stand strong together with a smile on our face, Mancunians forever,